So you want an easy life, huh? You want an easy, safe, comfortable life and not a life of all the good gifts that God gives and the virtue that comes through testing and trial? This is very problematic.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, where we are cultivating the maximum number of thinking moms we can. This is the podcast for classical homeschooling mamas who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. Scholé Sisters discusses topics that matter to those of us who believe that educating ourselves through reading widely, thinking deeply, and applying faithfully equips us for the task of educating our children. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. To get my free, almost weekly, mostly Charlotte Mason newsletter, go to afterthoughtsblog.net/subscribe and sign up. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 2 graduates. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of 2 excellent books, The Convivial Homeschool and Simplified Organization. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Did you sign up to do the 5x5 reading challenge this year? If so, you need to join the sistership as a Sophie member and get the accountability you need and the support you want. With weekly check-ins and quarterly Zoom-style meetups, you will be encouraged to continue in good reading habits as well as get fun advice on which book to read next. Just go to scholesisters.com/sistership and join as a Sophie. That's scholesisters.com/sistership. Today's episode is the 3rd in our 4-part series on Charlotte Mason's chapters from school education that cover the training of physical, intellectual, moral, and religious habits. Today, we're discussing the training of moral habits. You're going to love this conversation. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
Well, mine's going to be short. So This is Abby, and I'm going to talk very shortly about an incredibly long book. And I am slogging through War and Peace. So I saw the challenge where you read a chapter a day. That's not going to work for me. I've already did this because, it's very hard for me to read multiple fiction books at a time. So I prefer reading at bigger chunks, I guess, of this. It's going to take me longer than normal because it does have 362 or 63 chapters or something like that. So it's really a nice idea to, read a chapter a day or something like that. But I'm just going to listen to it in bigger chunks. So I'm in book 2 and partway through that. And right now I've just been learning a lot about different Russian families and how many children they have and all of their different names and sort of the setting. And there's been a few mentions of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, and there's some princes. So it's a lot of information and a lot of details. And there is a really great Substack that I've been following that kind of gives an overview of the weeks. And so that's been really helpful to kind of bring some of the details together. But it is Russian, so there's a lot of names and nicknames and different things. So,
and every 5th guy is Alyosha or whatever.
Yeah. So yes, so it's going well. I'm on track, and I'm listening, and I'm enjoying the narrator, and I'm going to just baby step my way through this book. But that's all I really have to say because, as many of you know, I do not love depressing Russian literature, and I have a sense of foreboding for my future reading. But it is interesting, and I can pay attention, and I can follow along. But it's just so much background details. I mean, there's a little bit about a marriage, and they were both very beautiful. But when they got married, they basically did not like each other. The girl was very sweet, and the man was just unimpressed by her and was very annoyed by her. So there's some really interesting details about not quite suitable marriages, perhaps. It looks good on the outside, but on the inside, it's, neither person is very happy and, trying to make the best of it. And then a father who is demanding of his daughter to learn math, even though she's well past school age and she hates geometry, but she can't quite ever seem to understand it. And her father is a brilliant mathematician. So there's some really interesting side stories, but she's a very dutiful daughter. And so she's very obedient and she does, what he asks, but she just can't seem to wrap her mind around these different proofs. And he gets very mad at her every day.
Wow.
So math tears in Russian literature.
I mean, we don't get enough of that in homeschooling.
Yeah.
So we definitely need it in a book.
Feels very relatable.
Yes, it does. So there's this overarching picture of what's happening within Russia and France and, all of that and the war. But then there's these really neat little vignettes that are just the inside of people. So I'll probably only be paying attention to the little drama of the Russian soap operas and probably miss the big picture.
Nice. Nice.
All right. Well, this is Misty, and I started my systematic theology tome for the year because I don't know how long it's going to take me. I usually read one systematic theology a year. And this year, I am reading Systematic Theology by John Frame. An Introduction to Christian Belief is the subtitle, and it is big. It's massive. It is in one volume. But it's about as big as a one-volume book can be.
Wow.
But I am loving it so far, actually.
Good.
I think I'm in chapter 3. I'm listening to it on audio, but I do own the hardback. And so I have a few quotes here. He starts off by talking about what is theology. And he goes off on some other definitions of theology by different people over the years, including, it sounds like some pretty actually non-Christian definitions of theology, quite honestly, in the, 20th century. But he says, in answer to the question, what is theology? He says, in my view, the only possible answer is this. The theologian states the facts and truths of Scripture for the purpose of edification. The truths are not stated for their own sake, but to build up people in the Christian faith. And then...
That's well said.
Yeah. And so that kind of sets the tone, too, for how he's approaching this whole tome. It really is not an academic tome for the sake of just laying out as many details as possible. His goal is edification of believers. And that comes across as he is developing these things. So he says, further, I think the church's problems today are not usually the problems that can be solved by novel interpretations of this or that passage. Our theological problems usually arise from our failure to note what is obvious.
That's funny.
Can you send me that quote, please?
Yeah.
I think I need that one in my commonplace book or to put on the refrigerator.
Yes.
Real subtle, Abby.
So, yeah, it's really great because his theme that he uses to kind of tie everything together is the lordship of Christ. And so then his second chapter is all about why that's his primary theme. And it's basically like, I don't know why this isn't everybody's primary theme.
Interesting.
Why would we pick any other theme? Because, how often the word Lord is used and how the, covenant is the theme of how God relates to his people all throughout Scripture. But to have a covenant, you have to have a Lord. So a covenant is dependent upon lordship. It's very clearly written. And so even though it's long, it's been very enjoyable to listen to, in like 20-minute chunks on a walk.
Nice. So you're listening to it?
I am listening to it,
okay.
Yeah. And then going back to the hardback for quotes.
Cool. Sounds good.
You, looks like, are also reading a tome.
Yeah. We
This
all
is all
are.
Abby's fault. All
Yeah,
Abby's
we
fault.
all
everyone. We're reading big books.
The fourth turning is here.
Yes.
Abby talked about it. I got sucked in. It is really good and it's very interesting. Though I do feel like I'm reading a piece of dispensational false prophecy.
Yeah.
I read it last year. I don't remember if I said this when I was talking about it on the show, but I was telling my mom about it. And I'm like, it's great because it's like end times meets Myers-Briggs personality.
Oh my gosh.
Like-
It's so true. So true. I need to read it with a newspaper next to me and compare. It's just that and the book of Revelation. It all goes together.
Yeah. And you should explain why. Like his two things that he thinks are going to happen to create this fourth turn or this, winter. the fourth
I mean,
turn.
I don't actually think I'm far enough into the book to answer to say that.
Well, Misty and I can.
But you could say it. You go ahead. You say it, and then I'll tell you if I got that far.
His prediction is that the event, what does he call it?
The crisis.
The
Yes,
climax. Winter.
yeah, but he calls it a Greek word.
Oh, right.
Oh. Yeah, that means
the
crisis. The turning.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah.
Eclatosis, something, I don't know. Anyway, it's a good word though. So I kind of wanted to use it, but and sound smart. But it is either that there will be a world war or a civil war. Texas.
Or both.
Feel free to come visit me in Texas.
Yeah, and
It's
now
a-
you just moved to Texas.
yeah.
I was like, oh, it's a sign. No.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, I thought
Just in
about that
time.
though. Misty and I both moved, and in this chapter, he's talking about this like geographic cohesion
Yep.
where people move to be with people more
Yep.
like them.
It's a thing.
It was kind of interesting.
Well, you put it in one of your newsletters, living the cliche.
Yeah, totally. I totally am. It's embarrassing. Hi, I'm from California. Like half of the people in this town. Sorry, you hate us all. I don't know. I did have one quote from this book so far.
Okay.
I mean, it's not one so far, as if I haven't underlined anything else. I just really resonated with it because this has been my big complaint about Republicans for like the last, 5 years, maybe longer. Let's see. He says, while Republicans have a reputation for being distrustful of government, surveys show that they are even more trusting than Democrats, so long as their leaders are in power.
Mhm.
And I just think, when we talk about those of us who are small government, I don't call myself a libertarian because I have very specific convictions that conflict with libertarianism, but I'm a libertarian sympathizer because I believe in small government. And then you elect somebody who you think is going to represent you as a small government person, and then they just grow the government like everybody else. They just grow it in ways that are a little bit more palatable to conservative minds or whatever. And you wonder why. And it's because I just don't think that the small government conviction is real for politicians.
Yeah.
Yep.
But they sound so nice that a lot of people get sucked in. Whenever you have a bloated government, then you're attracting people who are attracted to power for power's sake or power for personal sake. I won't go on and on, but I just thought like this is some of the problem is that there's not a real conviction. They only there's a certain group of people who actually only think the government should be smaller when Democrats are in charge. It's not a principle. It's just
Right.
this arbitrary
It's just
thing.
Us and them, and
Yeah.
no real principles.
Right. As someone who's read about things like economics since I was, probably too young to actually be doing it, I feel like my convictions go so far beyond party that I would leave the party tomorrow if there was a better place to go.
Yep.
I'm not, as much as I appreciate some of the history of republicanism with the anti-slavery movement and that kind of thing, which I actually think is aligned with a small government mentality, but they're far from that now. Anyhow, so that's enough politics to drive the anti-political people away.
Brandy, once again, living her stereotype on
That's
the
right.
podcast.
That's right. I mean, what are you guys going to complain about when you write your reviews if I don't bring up politics? Come on.
Hi, Abby here to invite you to join us in Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to talk about all things homeschooling. educational philosophy, books, and how to avoid burnout. Sistership is private and free. Free from ads, free from drama, and free to join. We wanted a place, no matter where we live, to find thinking mothers to discuss ideas, to become equipped and confident, and to not take ourselves too seriously. Sistership will encourage you to read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully all that you are learning. So, join us for the camaraderie and stay for the fun.
This discussion that we're having today is actually the third in our 4-part series on Charlotte Mason's chapters on building intellectual habits. She talks about different types of habits or practices. It's 4 chapters in a row. So we're talking through chapter 12 of Charlotte Mason's book, School Education, but we already did chapters 10 and 11. So if you want to hear those, you need to go back and listen to episodes 129 and 132 from last season. And then if you want to hear the one on religious training, which would be the last one, you're actually going to have to wait till fall because I thought we were going to do 2 this season and it turns out we're not. That's the story on the whole series. Today's we're going to focus on moral training, which I think is actually kind of a controversial thing in this everyone doing what is right in their own eyes culture that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to start where she starts. And she starts by spending a bit of time building a foundation. It's almost like this argument for moral training in the first place. She starts with 3, she calls them foundational principles, or maybe she says foundation principles. Anyway, 1, authority is the basis of moral teaching. 2, we should have principles rather than rules. And 3, we should recognize the vital character and inspiring power of ideas. So I thought just briefly, we need to go through and kind of explain what she means for people who haven't read this. And then I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on whether you agree or disagree or want to nuance something or whatever. So let's start with the first one, which is authority is the basis of moral teaching. Does anybody want to explain concisely what
That
she
would be
meant by that? Misty, would you please?
Well, yeah, this is what we've just been talking about in our mentorship inside sistership quite a bit with the book,
Mm-hmm.
The Golden Key, the idea of office.
Yes.
And how parents do have authority. And that authority is not innate within us. Like it's not our possession. The teaching that we give also is not something we are making up. We aren't the source of it. And so that means we have a responsibility. We're under authority. We have a responsibility that's given to us, and we're given the authority to transmit it. And so we have to know truth. We have to submit to God, and under God's authority, with his blessing, we are tasked with teaching our children to honor and obey us, and by extension, God himself. So the authority and the teaching, the basis of morality, it isn't just abstract floating out. It doesn't exist as a thing in itself outside, and it doesn't exist within us like something we choose or make up and then impose. It exists in reality in God. And the more we know him and love him and obey him, then we pass that along to our children because that's what we were told to do.
Yeah.
So it's also not optional.
I really like the way she tries to protect us from holding an arbitrary authority over our children, because they do, we all do it at times, right? And they do see right through it. And then sometimes they point it out, and that's annoying, but they're not wrong. Charlotte Mason has a couple chapters on authority itself I don't remember if it's this book or in some of her other books. I don't know. I didn't go look it up or anything, but I just remember feeling.
I think it is in this one. It's authority and docility. I'm pretty sure it's in early. It's 3.
So one of the early chapters then. Yeah. And she just, the way that she stands against arbitrariness and really helps us understand what authority is was very helpful for me, because I don't think I connected this idea of children obey your parents and the Lord for this is good with that concept. So it was good for them to obey me no matter what I said, right? I kind of had this so I can make stuff up that's just convenient for me or whatever.
Mhm.
When they were younger, that was kind of a thing I think that I struggled with. And I was really very convicted when I read her stuff that the commands I should be giving should be good commands. It is
Mhm.
good for them to obey me, especially when the things that I'm telling them to do are actually good. Not good
Mhm.
for me, not good for my life, but actually good. And it really helped me, I think, even just to kind of back way off as a mom to realize, you know what? I don't actually need to be giving commands about every aspect of their lives all of the time.
No.
So she does say that we should be aware of the limitations of authority. And so when she's talking about, she's very strong on authority. You have to have authority. Everything here is derived from authority. Authority gets a capital A. It's important to her. So I think it is good to point out that she says later about how we need to be aware of the limits. I guess maybe one limit is what I already pointed out about things not being arbitrary, but the other one, let me see if I can find it here at the bottom of 127. She says, basically, we're not supposed to compel. It kind of reminds me of other things we've said where we want there to be a component of free choice in their obedience. We're not looking for mechanical automatons that just obey everything any person who seems to be in authority does. We want them to be thinking people, and we're going to have to go the harder route, which is trying to help them have an affinity for good things and then making good choices versus just trying to tell them you have to do X. So she's not saying, you don't punish them if they do wrong or anything like that, but it's just you don't make them. If you make them, you're not ever sure it's actually them.
Well, and then they get to practice being wise and discerning, right?
Right.
Like
Exactly.
this is part of that small things so that when they get to bigger things, they can use wisdom and discernment, right? By
Right.
practicing obedience and is this what I'm going to do or am I going to disobey, right? Like that is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
True.
Yeah, it's keeping that end in mind.
Yeah.
We're not having them obey us or exercising authority for ourselves. It is for their good. And our goal for them is to become mature adults.
Right. Which is where that practicing of choice really, really packs a punch, is thinking about how if they don't have practice making any choices at all when they're young, then
Right.
what do we expect? So then we're so offended when they're making these bad decisions when they're teenagers, but it's like, well, you never let them make any decision at all
Yeah.
until they were like 15. So then why are we surprised that they did some dumb things, right? It's so much better to get the dumb stuff out of the way when you're like 9. I did really embarrassing things when I was 9 or 10. I'm so glad it happened then. Uh, okay. So the second principle is we should have principles rather than rules.
Mhm.
What's she getting at?
Well, I mean, that's spirit of the law versus the letter of the law, I think, in a
Mm.
lot of cases, right? Principles are broad and all encompassing, right? We can look at a certain situation that is not in the Bible specifically, but we should be looking for the principle of this. This is a hard decision. It doesn't say exactly this exact sentence in the Bible, so I can't. I've heard that argument, right? Like that, well, it doesn't say anything about this in the Bible. Okay, but what's the overarching principle? Does this line up with scripture and truth in a general sense? Sure, we can make it very, very unique and specific, but overall, that can lead to legalism. I think that having a ton of rules, kids having to remember every single rule rather than a guiding principle allows for a lot more freedom and a lot more applying that wisdom.
Mhm. I mean, really, even things like the 10 Commandments are principles
Absolutely.
more than they are rules.
Yeah.
Because then, like, the book of Deuteronomy is an exposition of all that's included in the 10 Commandments. And we have Jesus, applying it in different ways. And it's not that, okay, if you've never murdered anyone, you've kept that rule and you're good to go. It's like there's a principle there, not a rule. that's also the source of our principles as well.
Yeah, I was thinking that understanding some of these underlying principles really helps us have discussions with our children.
Mm-hmm.
So we can think about different biblical commands, not just the 10 commandments, because those are more like negative commands. Don't do this and don't do that. But there are other things, do justly, walk humbly. There's all these different things where instead of approaching a child as you broke this rule, God says not to do that.
Yeah.
Which is
Mhm.
true. Probably both of those things are absolutely true. But trying to get them to make a mental connection of, okay, this is what you did. And how does that mesh with the biblical command here, which is more of a principle. So it's not maybe specifically you shouldn't do this particular thing with this particular person, but it's definitely a violation of the principle. And trying to get them to draw that connection, I think,
Mhm.
can be more helpful than just, I told you not to do that, which is the easiest thing to do. Like I'm saying this and I'm thinking about the different times. That's exactly what I've said.
Yeah.
I didn't do a principle. I said, I told you not to do that. Why are you doing that?
And I want to be able to say it one time and have you remember and do it without me having to come back to this again.
Right. Mhm.
I said it once. How come you aren't just doing what I said?
What do you mean you didn't write down and cherish every single thing I ever said to you? I don't understand.
But even within the 10 commandments, they're stated negatively, but they contain the positive as well.
That's
so
true.
to not steal means we should be generous. And so it's like,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
side is your action proactively generous?
Mhm.
Or are you trying to, like get or keep your own? And so they do apply because it is the positive affection
True.
that we're going for, right? The Ordo Amoris.
True. She talks about duty in this chapter.
Yeah.
But she also talks about it a lot in Ourselves, which I've been reading with two of my kids. I'm at different places with them because I start in 7th grade. So anyway, she talks a lot about duty is, it's a debt that you owe because of this relationship that you have with someone. And she is very broad in that because, God, for example, commands you to love your neighbor as yourself. And so there's certain things implied by that. But I hadn't really, I don't know, something about the way that you said it, Misty, connected all of that to me, that this idea of generosity being a duty, being a debt that you owe to your fellow man in some way, or someone in your family in some way, or whatever. But that connection to theft, because it's can be hard to see the connection. I didn't take anything from anyone.
Right.
But you did if you believe in duty. If there's a debt that you owe and you didn't pay it, you're essentially stealing. People who don't
Mhm.
pay their debts, they don't pay their bills, they are stealing from somebody because the debt is always paid. It's just paid by the person you left holding the bag.
Mhm.
But in that dynamic where you owed generosity and didn't give it, how is that theft? Well, you have to believe in duty for that to be theft. So I think I didn't quite understand. I understood duty as it connected to morality, but I didn't understand why she brought it up the way she did. But I think that's why. I think it connects the
Mhm.
positive and negative commands.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Number 3, we should recognize, and I assume, she doesn't really talk about leveraging it, but obviously a lot of her work does. We should recognize the vital character and inspiring power of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That gets into just even how you would implement some of the principles like rules.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
In order for them to grab onto it for themselves, they need that inspiring idea. They need to have the aha moment for themselves. Like, oh, this is why this is right. Or I see that God calls me to this, or however the little personal revelation comes to them. I think that's what she's going for. She wants it to be theirs and not just ours that we're imposing on them as a standard.
Well,
Right.
and I think, Brandy, you were mentioning it before, but just, looking through all of the books of the law in the Old Testament, like they got really specific about different things and how we can get really, really specific about things, or we can use the Bible as like, well, look at, this is what the Bible says, instead of like presenting the Bible
The
story
whole.
and then letting them, narrate it, ruminate on it, instead of the whole, like, let me give you my commentary now about how you did this wrong, like using it as a way to get your point across, like hitting them over the head with it sometimes. And sometimes, yes, we do that. But like, I think that's doesn't she talk about that being the talkie or something like that, right? Different place, like where we're just using it for our own.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a dangerous thing to read the Bible at our children.
Yes, thank you. Very concise.
Again, I do think we've also all done it.
Yeah.
I mean, even when we try to just have these habits of reading with them or whatever, and we're trying not to pick on anybody, I can't tell you, I went through a stage where we just read the proverb of the day, right? Like if it was January 1st, we read Proverbs 1, January 2nd, Proverbs. And it's a great thing to do. We read it over and over and over. And my kids probably like don't ever want to read the book of Proverbs again. But even in that pattern, when I wasn't picking on anybody, it was just the 6th of January. So this is what we were doing. I could totally end up halfway through aiming a verse at some child on the couch, right? Like it's just
giving them a side eye.
Totally. Of course, I will say that sometimes I wasn't even thinking of it, but pillows did fly and people did point at someone. That was ordained by God.
That's the sanctifying influence of siblings.
That's right. It's good for them.
I think it is sometimes hard to distinguish that difference between ideas and, I don't know if the opposite would be facts. And sometimes we think just like the fact, like, okay, this is good, therefore do it, ought to be enough. And really it's just us saying it. But we actually need to lead them to the truth that's beyond our words and beyond our authority. Our authority is to draw them to the authority beyond us, not to stop in us. So if we aren't taking them to the reality that, the world is operating under, and we're just saying, okay, I said this, so therefore that's enough for you. We aren't giving them the basis to become their own responsible adult, making decisions, making choices, being responsible before God for themselves, which is our goal. And so the more we can lead them to that, it comes back to knowing and also maybe trusting the interconnectedness of knowledge and wisdom.
Well, and how many times I have said something in earnestness and trying to, instill something in my children. And then we read a story about this kind of same principle idea. And the kids are like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And then they take it as their own. And it's like, I have said that. Like multiple times to you guys. And now, like thinking that in your mind. And then you just have to rejoice that there you go. Yeah. There's an idea that you're getting. Right. And it's your own.
Right.
Like being okay not to take credit for like, I've already told you.
I think sometimes some of it is just cumulative, right? Like how many times, well, even they talk about it in marketing, like you have to hear about a product, 7 times or something before you
17.
buy it. Okay, 17, even worse than I thought. So it could be that they heard it 16 times at home and number 17 with their football coach or their pastor or something. And we're like, if I just said it one more time. But, someone else gets to enjoy the fruit.
That's right.
The final planting. Well, I think there's 2 sections in here that are controversial because of culture, controversial because of certain theological systems. So we're going to hit both of them.
Woohoo! Excellent.
So the first one is on page 129. And there's 2 subheadings on that page. And one of them says, morals do not come by nature. And then she has a big long paragraph after that explaining what she means. And then she follows up with the next subheading, children born neither moral or immoral. And then she has a big long paragraph after that. But what I have found is certain kinds of well-meaning people read the subheadings and then desert the book because they believe that Charlotte Mason is denying the fallen nature of mankind. And we're going to do a closer reading and try to discover what she actually means because we don't think she's saying that. So, any volunteers for starting on this one?
Well, a closer reading, I think, does just start with reading it. And the thing is, really, they aren't long paragraphs, really.
No.
Mm-mm.
It's just a few sentences, and they really are.
I mean, they're Victorian sentences. So there's like
That's
semicolons
true.
and stuff.
It's true.
Yeah, but with all the semicolons, it's like 3 sentences.
See, that's what I mean. Victorians, they get away with this stuff.
A lot of commas and semicolons.
That's right.
I think, well, it was interesting because in the beginning of the section, she says something about discerning the signs of the times in the moral teaching and in what we give instruction in. We need to be teaching to the errors and tendencies of our day.
Mm-hmm.
And that really then is what she is doing here in this section, especially in Children Are Born Neither Moral Nor Immoral. She says, it was interesting to notice that the meeting, consisting of able, educated people, divided itself into those who held that children were born true and those that held they were born false.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we know about the history of England or the history of thought and moral philosophy, especially in the 20th century, there was this little, and it really was kind of short-lived,
Mm-hmm.
bubble theory of childhood development and human nature that taught that people, well, it had to do with genetics, that like your moral makeup was genetic. If you were born false, they mean irredeemable. There's no hope anyway. They don't mean born fallen. They mean you were born to be a criminal and there's nothing anyone can do about that.
Right.
Like the best thing you can do is just put people like that in workhouses, or like if they die, it's actually better for everyone. And this is, we get some really terrible things happening in the 20th century because of thoughts like this.
I really think eugenics used part of that as a justification.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
These wicked people were breeding, and somehow the people who wanted to kill them thought they were morally superior, which is
Yes.
baffling. But anyway.
Because they're less human,
Right.
So yeah, it is just understanding someone's context and reading what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And she's not saying that people aren't sinful. She's saying that we don't know who is redeemable, for one, who
Mm-hmm.
God it will save. So our efforts, our evangelism and all of that, we don't call people hopeless.
Right.
And that's what people were doing in her day.
Yeah, she says, nobody reflected that every human being comes into the world with infinite possibilities for good and, alas, infinite possibilities for evil. When we read her second principle, and that's one of her most controversial principles, where she says, possibilities. Children are born with possibilities. They're not born in this predetermined sense where we can know because of their family connections or whatever exactly what they're going to be like. Instead, they have potential. And so our goal as educators, I mean, we're moms, but when we talk about education, the goal of the educator should be to try to draw out the best in that child, because we don't know. We don't know that this isn't the moment where their best can start to be born, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she says, even with evil hereditary tendencies, which may be rectified by education, or good tendencies, which is bringing up may nullify. And I think we've all seen or heard of both of those directions. You have someone with a lot of potential who then is kind of left to do his own thing. And even though there's a lot of intelligence, a lot of ability, a child left to himself brings shame to his mother, right? We've got proverbs on all of these principles as well.
I remember thinking that about a friend of mine who we had gone to the same school. He was one of my best friends when we were little, like really little, like second or third grade. And then my parents pulled me out of that school because it was a terrible school, and they put me at a different school, and he stayed. And so then we lived close to each other. I could just trace it. Thankfully, this wasn't the end of the story for him. But I just remember by the time we hit junior high thinking like, they've killed something about him. I remember him being this really smart, interesting person who was interested in the world around him. And now he is dull and he is not interested. And I felt like it was tied directly to the school. So it wasn't so much his upbringing And yet it was, because the school had him 7 hours a day or whatever at
Right.
that point. And so they really were the ones bringing him up. But I remember that was like the first time that my child mind grasped that the way that you're brought up, the school that you're in, that you actually could be damaged by that, because I saw my friend change. And I knew that he wasn't changing because of what was happening at home, because I was around his home enough to know that that wasn't what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was just one of those moments, where you look back and you think, thankfully, there's more to that story than just where school left him. But still, I was sad for him as a child. I think another thing, though, in this section that can be a problem is a misunderstanding, actually, of the words moral and immoral.
Mm.
She says, for example, morals do not come by nature. And then she says, no doubt every child is born with a conscience.
Mm-hmm.
So she's differentiating between conscience and morality. That is, with a sense that he ought to choose the right and refuse the wrong. But he's not born with the power to discern good and evil. An educated conscience is a far rarer possession than we imagine. And so she's really talking about training, and she talks later about moral education. She says, we believe that Latin and Greek must be taught, but that morals come by nature. So she's really making an argument for direct teaching of morality, and not just assuming. I think this can happen where you see parents that are like, I raised them in the church, I don't understand what happened, but there weren't real conversations happening at home. Like, nobody really talked about what is right and what is wrong. And I remember realizing at one point that I was expecting my kids to just kind of like intuit certain things. And then realizing that when I spelled it out, it cleared up a lot of things for them.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
like they just needed direct teaching. They needed mom to actually guide them.
Well, and we are all so good at self-deception, at telling ourselves like, this isn't that. And we're given parents who love us and who are paying attention and who say, hey, guess what? That's actually stealing. Or
Right.
guess what? That's actually lying. Like when you check something off on your checklist and you didn't actually do it, that's called a lie. And they would tell you that a lie was bad, but they had a whole elaborate justification in their minds for they meant to do it. They were going to do it. It's like, whatever. But when you check it off, it means it has been done. So even if you did do it later, when you checked it off, you're lying if it's not done. And that's the kind of education of a conscience that it's really a parent's responsibility to lay into.
Right.
Yeah, think about it too. Like, if we are training our kids to do chores, we show them, we help them, we inspect, which is far easier than understanding and teaching a moral principle. So why wouldn't we have to have some ideas about how to teach this? Yeah, there are moments that come up spontaneously that are like, oh, this is a perfect, wasn't it the phrase like teachable moment? Wasn't that like a big thing? I don't know, years ago or whatever. But this idea that we are actually making a plan for teaching these moral things, because if we have to train them up in how to do bathroom cleaning and taking care of things, then how much more so is their training of that conscience, right?
I look up the word morality. She's saying children are born neither moral or immoral. And in the etymological dictionary, morality is tied to this idea of like your manner of being or your character. It is completely true that children are not born with character, because character is developed and then proven over time. And by definition, there has not been enough time for like this little baby in my arms to have any character at all. And does he have morals? He may have a conscience, but he only has morals to the extent that I have taught him what is right and what is wrong. And when he's 6 months old in my arms, how much can he really know?
Not to bite.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's the one thing that they could know. Actually, I guess I can say I spank people now that I don't spank people anymore. But like, I remember spanking someone for playing with raw chicken when they were like 9 months old, but I could tell they knew that I had told them not to do it. And they did it anyway. And I was terrified they were going to get salmonella. And that was the first time I ever gave a spanking to anybody. Okay, so now you know who it was. But anyway, I just realized that. But I was
it's okay, Brandy. You're in Texas now.
I know, really.
It's okay. No one's going to come after you.
I thought he was going to die. I was like, he's sucking on raw chicken grease or whatever. Like, he pulled the paper, that paper that comes with the chicken? It's like absorbing whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pulled it out of the trash and sucked on it. It was so disgusting.
Like, that is wrong and bad. And
That's
here I'm
right.
going to
right.
instruct you
That's right.
in a way that you will remember that this is not something that we do.
And see, he knew because I had already told him and I saw him looking longingly at the trash can and I told him no. But anyway, I just was thinking like, she's not talking about their internal state of being. Your morals are something that you pick up over time, either through teaching or indirectly, just from the responses that you get as you're navigating through life if you aren't taught directly, right? Which is why we can end up with messed up morals when nobody teaches us directly, because we're just trying to figure it out and we're kind of right, but kind of wrong because nobody taught us anything. But the idea that we would somehow equate this with the spiritual state of the child as overlooking what morals actually are. They're not something that you're born knowing. You have to be taught morals in order to know what morals are. It also can give us some compassion for some of the things we see.
Yeah.
I remember my girls, this was when they were quite a bit younger. So it was like they had just kind of figured out what modesty was. And they were so like super proud of themselves for being modest or whatever. And so they were being really like modest snobs. I remember them seeing this, girl. She was like, I mean, they were not teenagers. And she was like a teenage girl. And she's like dressed, like a prostitute basically, but probably wasn't one, I don't think. And so they're like making comments out as we're driving in the car, right? So we're like stopped at the stoplight so they could linger and feel more and more prideful the more they looked at her, which is so awesome. And so then they just start, making comments about her as we're driving away. And I finally was like, how do you know if her mother ever even taught her how she should dress? How do you know? How do you know how she ended up this way? Maybe you should have a little more compassion. And then the more I read this, the more I thought about how like we feel like people should just know. Doesn't she know that she should be not, walking around with all of this hanging out or whatever? But I actually think sometimes they don't. Especially because they're now engulfed in a culture where that could be seen as normal.
Yeah, it's like we're born with a conscience. We're born with the ability to discern right and wrong and a tendency toward drawing that line. But that doesn't mean that where we end up drawing the line is correct. We have an innate sense that there is right and wrong. But because we're fallen, where we end up drawing those lines, our default's not going to be correct. Right. Our default has to be measured by and trained by the Word of God and people in authority who have been trained by the Word of God, if our conscience is going to be educated and correct.
Yeah. I guess that takes us right into moral teaching because she recommends that we procure moral teachers and act as moral teachers for the children. And, seeing what she recommended, why do you think she recommended the things she did? Is there anything that you would take away or anything you would add? I'm curious what you think about the different things that she said about where we would get moral teaching.
Well, she says in biographies, patriotic poems,
catechism,
mottos.
Mottos.
I mean, she did start with the 10 Commandments, which obviously, Misty, you already used as an example, but it was there. That was her first thing.
And ethical teaching of the Middle Ages. She talks about how it was communicated through art.
Oh, right. The paintings of the different virtues. Yeah, I don't think I ever would have thought of that on my list of things.
Well, I think a lot in the Middle Ages, they did use art because people couldn't read. Like they used art to communicate as we would a book. To overcome illiteracy.
I was thinking about how the Westminster Catechism has all the different sections on the 10 Commandments and elaborates on the different applications of them. And I found that really helpful. I didn't read that until I was an adult, but I thought it was really helpful because I had never thought broadly about the 10 Commandments. I just had kind of thought like, yeah, of course you don't murder.
Yeah, right.
And I was able to differentiate between murder and war. And so that was like the extent of it.
Yeah, the Heidelberg Catechism does that also.
Does it? Okay. I wasn't sure. We're actually starting on that, but we haven't gotten that far yet. I suppose, she says our Lord's exposition of the moral law. And it is true that if I had thought a little harder, I mean, Christ does say that if you hate your brother, then you're in violation of the commandment to not murder. So, I mean, he does give us some of that. We don't need the Westminster Catechism for that. It just puts it together in one neat and tidy place. But I just, for whatever reason, as a kid, didn't put those two things together in my brain until I read the Westminster Catechism. Anyway, again, the child mind is interesting.
I really thought it was interesting, her section on mottos and her like idea there.
Of a yearbook?
Of a yearbook. So basically a commonplace book. Perhaps under headings, perhaps not, from all the readings, the Bible, poetry, the best prose. It would not be a bad idea for children to make their own yearbook with a motto for each day in the year, culled from their own reading. What an incentive to a good day it would be to read in the morning as a motto of our very own choice and selection, and not the voice of an outside mentor. Keep ye the law, be swift in all obedience. I mean, I've selected mottos for my children and made them repeat them.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, that probably would be better for them to pick their own.
Yeah, we've been trying to do that. My twins have an online book discussion group that they meet with weekly. And one of the things that they are supposed to do is bring a commonplace quote. And they were really struggling with this. And so we did have to make it assignment, but they got to choose their commonplace quotes. But I gave them some parameters, which really did help, which was like, you have to pick from 2 different things you are reading. And I would like you to also add a Bible verse, because we read the Bible every morning. And so you pick a verse, either from Proverbs, which we read together, or in your own personal stuff that they've been doing with a Bible class. So you can choose, but those are the 3 things that you're going to do. And that really helped them a lot. And sometimes I will even hint, we'll be reading Bob Schultz, and Bob Schultz always has a little quote at the beginning of his lesson or the chapter. And I was like, well, that might be a good, commonplace quote. And, so sometimes it just takes a little bit of training on that too, because if you just tell people the commonplace and you just say, well, you just pick a good quote, and they need a little bit more help. So that has really helped. And then they have something to share every week.
I really think we underestimate these kinds of activities, the notebooking type of activities. I remember Lori Bestvater included the Book of Mottos in her book, The Living Page. I haven't thought about that for a long time, but I remember she had it in there. The act of choosing for yourself and the power behind that. I remember that. So this is like a different subject. It wasn't mottos, but I had one child who just insisted that he hated poetry. I mean, he would just grumble and complain, I hate poetry. Poetry is the worst, right? Like it was just this constant refrain at our house. And Ambleside Online assigns reading of poetry basically every day. I made him start a poetry book, and it was like, you have to choose your favorite poem from the week. So you read 5 this week, or you read 4 this week, and you have to choose one of those and put it into your book. And I did say, like, you can cut it out and glue it in there, or you could handwrite it, whatever you want to do. Like, I didn't want to have a whole lot of barriers to entry on this thing. So then at the end of the term, you have 12 different poems that you've chosen that were your favorites. And so then you can choose your favorite. So you go back through and read them all. And that one can be your memory poem for the next term. And it is funny because now this child is the one that likes poetry the best. But I really think it changes the dynamic when you're having them choose.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had to choose from a selection. He didn't choose from just anything. But being able to back up and put it on him and changing the demeanor by choose your favorite. So now we're not complaining. We're like trying to judge which one's best, or trying to appreciate it a little more or something. Anyway, so I could see that with mottos, like if we're really struggling with a child who is kind of rebellious or whatever, like how that kind of an assignment could specifically help a child like that, because you're putting more of it on them.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You're making them take ownership. And I think especially when you do step out of the way as much as you can, and you're not insisting that they like it, but you are insisting they do something, kind of whether you like it or not, and just let that time and exposure work in them. Because, I mean, then they are working with those ideas themselves. And it's the ideas that are going to inspire and attract more than mom's words, actually.
Yeah, that's really true. Well, and it is also true that it's not like an instantaneous thing. Because like with the poetry
Right.
thing, it's not like, so then after one term, he was a big fan of poetry.
Right.
It's just now I can look back to how we did this a number of years ago. And now he's the biggest fan of poetry in the family. But when exactly that transition happened, I'm actually not sure. I couldn't pinpoint a particular time, but I do think the activity, which I didn't continue for years and years and years, but I do think the activity itself helped change his relationship with the thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, exposure breeds taste.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Well, are you ready for our next controversial subject?
Yeah.
So in Norms of Nobility, David Hicks basically talks about, there's a lot of different takes on classical education. He draws a dividing line for classical education to say, like, who is, quote, classical and who is not, basically, as classical believes that virtue exists and it can be taught. And those who fall outside of classical believe that virtue cannot be taught. They may or may not believe that it exists. So he says, the difference between this group and this group is how they thought virtue should be taught.
Right.
Within David Hicks's economy for how he thinks about these things, I remember telling someone that was why I thought Charlotte Mason was classical, because she believed that virtue existed and it could be taught.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently that's a controversial thing to say. So does this chapter make you believe or not believe that Charlotte Mason believes that virtue exists and could be taught? Give evidence for your assertion.
Yeah.
Give evidence from the text for your assertion.
I think before we do that, we have to say, I think this is only controversial when we don't define terms.
Good point. Okay.
And especially today, and this maybe goes, this is why her point earlier about Rosaria, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts with Rosaria on her new book, Rosaria Butterfield. And she's been saying, like, you have to know what time it is. Well, what are the errors of our day that we need to know about so that we can be on guard about? And the tendency of our day, both outside the church and inside the church, is to flatten all the terms, to not see distinctions where there are distinctions. And it's a part of that, I think, polarization. That, talks about it in The Fourth Turning is Here, and we can all see it all around us. But polarization, a part of that happening is when you flatten terminology and say, no, it's this or that, it's black or white, it's
no nuance.
Nuance goes into a whole different problem. People who use nuance usually are saying, like, no, actually, it doesn't really matter what anyone. Let's be nuanced. Let's say
That's
that
not what I was
morals
meaning.
don't
I'm
matter.
sorry.
I know you meant it in the actual definition of the word.
So now we have to define nuance.
We have to define every single word we're using. It's so terrible. But, virtue is not the exact same thing as morality, is the exact same thing as goodness, is the exact same thing as righteousness. English has a lot of words that are synonyms, but there aren't equal signs between synonyms. English has a richness of vocabulary more than most other languages because we have so many different words that have a different history. They draw on different etymological roots, and then they have different connotations with how they've been used in the past. And so unless we have this broader understanding of history and literature, like the more knowledge we have, the more we realize how much meaning is in each word and what is really being said, especially by these older writers that presume the distinctions and that the connotations. To say that virtue can be taught is not the same thing as saying it's a parent's job to be sure their child is saved, or it's a parent's job to be the Holy Spirit. There is such a thing as a virtuous pagan. This is a category that has existed for a long time. So virtue is not the same thing as Christ's righteousness that's imputed to us. And I think sometimes that's where, like, by saying virtue can be taught, you're saying
that you can save your child or education can save your child.
Right. it comes down to being ridiculous that you can't say that. Of course, you can't say that you can impute Christ's righteousness to yourself or your child, obviously. So then, therefore, virtue can't be taught. And it's like, well, there's a difference there. There's a distinction to be made there.
She doesn't go into it a ton. Not here. She just says virtues in which children should be trained. Should, by the way, I would point that out.
Right.
But I thought it was interesting where she puts it on the parents to know for themselves. I have encountered so many homeschool moms that were like, I don't really know what virtue is, so I want to buy a virtue curriculum to teach my children.
Mm-hmm.
And she goes absolutely in the opposite direction of that because she says parents should take pains to have their own thoughts clear as to the manner of virtues they want their children to develop. Candor, fortitude, temperance, patience, meekness, courage, generosity, indeed the whole role of the virtues would be stimulating subjects for thought and teaching, offering ample illustrations. And she does have a caution at the end, which we'll get to. But she's really saying here that before we try to teach this stuff, we really need to know what we're about and what we even think about virtue, which I think is a real challenge because in our culture, people despise virtue. It's not something that we talk about. I mean, we really have to go. I'm thinking like contentment. People still go back to the Puritans to try to read about contentment.
Because it's lost.
Right. It's a lost virtue. It's not something that we hold up as a virtue, as something admirable. We don't really even talk about it in our culture. I think we often want to jump to some sort of virtue. We want our kids to have something we don't have. And that is, I think, a noble thing. But when we're jumping to trying to impose it in ways that might not be appropriate because we don't even understand what the virtues are.
Mm-hmm.
So we really have to back up and spend some time thinking about what those things are before we think about how we can develop it. Can a curriculum really give your kid patience?
No. I was thinking this too, and everyone's lives are so different. We don't need to set up fake situations for our children to try and exemplify virtue. Like that's what a curriculum kind of makes me feel like, because virtue is in the moment. Like we can talk about it, we can discuss it, but like the training of it is when the rubber meets the road. It is in the barn when you want to go to the potluck at church, but all of the lambs need to be fed and you have to still cheerfully feed and water and straw the entire barn because that's what happens sometimes. And that is developing fortitude and patience and generosity to, the animals. And not everyone will have that scenario play out in their lives because we do ranching things. And so for someone to be trying to facilitate something, that's really hard to do. It has to be in your real life because that's where it's real.
Yeah. And the curriculum attempt, I think, is an attempt to keep it safe and controlled. And really, the virtues are not safe or controlled. And, even just math. We all have to teach our kids math. And that probably offers enough opportunity right there for noticing which virtues your child lacks and working on the virtues while making them do the math.
Yes.
So that actually reminds me of Charlotte Mason's principle, right? That education is an atmosphere. And what is she really talking about? When you get into what she's really talking about, she's talking about how all of life can be leveraged for the education that we're trying to give our children. That it's not just in the books, as important as the books are because they contain the ideas, but how do they learn to apply? It's actually within education as an atmosphere. So some of the examples she gives are really concrete. It's things like learning to sit still and listen when grandmother is visiting, and how little kids, they get bored with what the grownups are talking about or whatever. And she expected them to learn to sit there or be quiet while the baby is napping, like that type of consideration and kindness and patience. She expected it to be taught just in daily life. It wasn't a curriculum. It was coaching, really, which gets back to why we need to know what it is.
Yes.
Because we really can't coach if we don't have a clear vision of what does it really mean to be patient. There are applications of things that look like virtues that are actually not. They're a form of passive behavior or just desirable behaviors. I have a friend that always says, well, nice isn't a virtue,
Right.
Yeah.
but our culture thinks it is.
Right.
So it's like, if we're not careful.
Well, and like our culture misdefines kindness.
Right.
And so we have to be aware.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, maybe it comes back to teaching from fear when we feel like we feel the weight of the responsibility of teaching our children and that we aren't prepared and we don't have the virtue and the character that we want them to have.
Mm-hmm.
But to recognize that if God has given us this task to educate our children, he's giving us that task to train us like we are training our children. And so it's for our sanctification. It's not that we have to already have mastered everything so that we can perfectly impart exactly what our children need. But as we are training our children, God is training us, and he's going to train us in these virtues as we learn about them and try to teach them. And that's also kind of scary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you hear it all the time. Actually, this is becoming a pet peeve over the years, where it's kind of a joke among Christians to say, oh, don't pray for patience, because then you're going to have to use it. God's going to give you the situation where you're going to, I was like, well, so you want an easy life, huh? You want an easy, safe, comfortable life and not a life of all the good gifts that God gives and the virtue that comes through testing and trial? This is very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Ask for patience. That's the whole point of James. Trust God.
Yes.
Ask for patience, ask for fortitude, and know, that means life is going to get harder because God is good. Do you trust him? And when you say, well, I'm not going to pray for patience because I don't want life to be hard, that is unfaithfulness. That is disobedience. Quite like it really is what it boils down to. So,
and if you're not praying for, can I just say, if you're not praying for patience, are you going to fly off the handle at your kids? Like, I really do think that it is very good for me to pray for patience so that I do not fly off the handle with my children and act without self-control. There's going to be opportunities for patience regardless. So you might as well pray about it because the Lord gives generously.
And receive the practice.
Yes.
As a goodness of your Lord.
Yes.
Giving to you generously. Yeah.
It's interesting what you said, Abby, about the alternative being flying off the handle, because I was thinking about how when I fly off the handle, well, that's unkind. So it's interesting how the concept of unity, right? These things are not actually isolated from each other. So when I don't have one, I, as a result, end up lacking somewhere else. And it can kind of be this cascade. It's like the vice cascade. It's because all of these things actually are like dominoes. They touch each other, they affect each other. And so it's actually a bigger deal. I mean, I feel like it's a big deal to not have patience. And yet it's probably an even bigger deal than I think because I don't see all the consequences of me not having patience.
Well, and it's like, if I'm not praying for patience, impatience doesn't go away, right? Like it's not a guarantee. I don't know. I find this, yes, very problematic, as you do, Missy, right? Or all of us do, but impatience is still going to be there. When I am practicing patience, I'm still, my heart isn't quite right. Like I am trying to order my affections to be more patient, right? To be more at peace with things. If I'm praying for the peace of God, which passes all understanding, it's because I am feeling anxious, right? Like there are things that we can do, and we are holding to truth, and we're holding the line, and we are seeking the Lord in this moment, right? We are weak and helpless, and where we are weak, he is strong, and we are turning our eyes to him. And that is what we need to do.
Yeah. There isn't a neutral state. It's like, if you aren't asking for patience and practicing patience, you don't have a neutral, neither patient nor impatient.
Yeah.
You are going to get more of the vice if you aren't moving toward virtue. You are going one direction or another.
Yeah.
There's always movement, one direction or another.
Yeah. And I personally would I really want to draw near to God because
Right.
He draws near to
Yes.
us.
Yeah. Well, as we start to wrap up, I wanted to talk about her caution at the very end because, this whole thing is about moral training. And I think her caution is important. And she says, a child's whole notion of religion is being good, or at least it can be that, right? It is well that he should know that being good is not his whole duty to God, although it be so much, or it is so much of it, that the relationship of love and personal service, which he owes as a child to his father, as a subject to his king, is even more than the being good, which gives our Almighty Father such pleasure in his children. She's cautioning us against boiling down their relationship or allowing their conception of their relationship to God to be boiled down into some sort of works righteousness thing where they see any virtue they have, any morality that they have playing out as part of their love for God rather than them trying to earn his favor or something.
Mhm.
And I felt like, well, that's a good place. That's a good caution because there is what is legalism really? It's where at least it seems to me, I can honestly say I've never really been in a legalistic environment that I can think of. But I think a lot of it comes down to, well, not being secure in the work of Christ, first of all, and in the work that he's done for us. But it seems like there's this insecure footing where you almost view God as someone who's holding a grudge against you. He's keeping a record of your wrongs.
A measuring stick you have to reach.
Right. And so we want to teach our children morals, but that's not the place where we want to end up. This idea that your morality is this measuring rod and it's this weight that's being held over your head that you couldn't possibly carry or whatever. Like it does go wrong sometimes. And I do think that's part of the resistance within the Christian community of I'm not going to teach morals because I saw it done incorrectly.
Right.
But that's not the proper response, right? Because that's not biblical. And it's not right thinking. God does call us to certain things and he did create human beings. I mean, you talked about pagan virtue. He did create human beings to be able to strive for a certain level of excellence. We just have to do it in a balanced way, but we do have to watch for this because you have those kids that sometimes even stumble into that mentality and they don't tell you.
Yeah.
And
That's
you find
true.
out, I've had this happen with some of my children with things where it's like, I find out, like 3 or 4 years later that they accepted some idea, not this particular one, but they've accepted an idea or they had a peculiar thought that now it got the way that they were living it out got big enough that I'm like, oh, what is going on here? And it turns out it was because of some sort of misunderstanding, theological or otherwise, that they had, many years earlier. So I think trying to make sure when we teach morals that we're couching it in the right way and then the right understanding of the world and God and how we relate to him is important.
Which is why moms need to be reading scripture all the way through, all the time.
Yeah.
And why it is helpful to read theology works and catechisms and all of that, because it's so easy to do that swing from one ditch into the other. And we see both ends of the ditch more often than we see the right path. So like legalism and attempting being good for the sake of being good is one side of the ditch. But another very common side of the ditch now is that actually God doesn't care if you're good or not.
Yeah. That's
right.
Yeah, that's one.
And it's just my relationship with God. He'll forgive anything. So it doesn't really matter if I'm good. It's just that I have feelings about God that are warm and fuzzy, and therefore I'm good.
I guess we forget that Christ says that if you love me, you'll keep my commandments.
Yeah. It's it's so easy to swing from one end to the other and to assume that anyone teaching against one ditch is acting from the other ditch.
Right.
Actually, that's kind of where I'm at in that systematic theology with Frame. He's lining out the covenants that God has made throughout scripture and showing like God is acting unilaterally and this is his lordship and he's doing all the work and calls for faithfulness, a faithful response from his people. This is a common denominator, actually, Old Testament, New Testament. And some interpretations do try to flatten that and say, but we actually have to hold both and, make that discerning call and notice how much of the New Testament, yes, is theology, and then says, because of all this truth, God has created us to be zealous for good works.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it isn't one or the other. Christ's righteousness being applied to us and our being zealous for good works go together. They aren't opposed to one another at all. Someone being zealous for good works isn't necessarily a legalist.
Well, I think that's a great way to end.
Yeah.
And we do know that virtue and morality is a parent's job to teach because the Bible tells us that it is. So I feel like that parents train up
Right.
your children
The way they should go. Yes.
Mhm.
in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I
Mhm.
think that means that that's something we're supposed to do.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Well, with that said, I'll just thank you both for coming. This has been a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you guys.
It was fun.
It was fun.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Please make sure you are following us in your favorite podcast player so that you don't miss our upcoming fantastic episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with her. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to ScullySisters.com/SS136 to check it out. Don't forget to sign up for a Sophie membership and go deep with your 5x5 challenge by finding some reading camaraderie. Go to ScullySisters.com/sistership and sign up for the Sophie membership. Our next episode is one we are super excited about. Abby and I got the chance to sit down with Vigan Garoyan and discuss truth in fairy tales. You are going to love this one. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
I was like,